Alright, good evening folks, it's Enforcer Matt and welcome back to another Short War video, and today we have major news coming out of Poland that a major Polish NATO general has been dismissed from his post following a counterintelligence investigation into a security clearance, and he's now been replaced effective immediately, and he was also involved in training Ukrainian soldiers, so there's some red flags going up as to whether or not there's a security breach within NATO. We're also learning that Putin has started threatening Western NATO nations once again if they dare to host F-16s for use in Ukraine. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into our first article of the day, which goes to us on Twitter at It's the Enforcer. And in this post we can see Poland has dismissed General Jaroslaw Gromadzynski from his position as commander of the European military body after the country's counterintelligence service launched an investigation into a security clearance, according to DW and Reuters, and in recent months he'd been serving as part of the international assistance team for Ukraine in Wiesbaden, Germany, where he was involved in the training of Ukrainian soldiers. So with that, we're moving on to our next article here, which also goes to us on Twitter, and in this one, we're learning the Russian President Vladimir Putin scoffed at the possibility of his country launching an attack on a NATO member, calling it sheer nonsense, but he warned that any Western airbase hosting US-made F-16 fighter jets that are slated for deployment in Ukraine would be a legitimate target for the Kremlin's forces, according to AP News. And this is the finest version of double talk if I've ever heard any. So Putin says here in this post that he is not going to launch an attack on a NATO member, but if a Western country has a Western airbase hosting the F-16s, then he would actually strike that. So that's doublespeak, because if he strikes a Western airbase in a Western nation that's in NATO, that's going to be a very likely an invocation of Article 5, which would put us into a direct conflict with Russia. So moving on to our next post here, we have one from Anton Geroshenko, and we actually have the video of Putin saying this himself. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video and see what he has to say.
Конечно, если они будут применяться с аэродромов третьих стран, они для нас становятся легитимной целью.
So in this video here, it is in Russian, of course, he is speaking Russian, but the translation is the F-16 fighter aircraft will be a legitimate target for Russia if they are used from third country airfields. And also, he did go on to say later that he would actually strike Western airfields as well if they were launched from there. So Russia basically saying that they're going to declare war on the West if F-16s get involved in the fight inside of Ukraine. And as of right now, the first F-16s for Ukraine are slated to be early summer, midsummer maybe. So it's just a few months away that F-16s might actually get on the battlefield in Ukraine. So we'll have to wait and see if Russia's actually going to back up their statements here and actually cause that big of an escalation. But with that, we're moving into our next post here, which goes to Nexta on Twitter. And we're learning of a fighter jet crashing over Sevastopol, and according to Ukrainian media, it could be a Russian Su-35 fourth generation fighter jet, which is very expensive, and according to unconfirmed information, the military plane could have allegedly been shot down by Russian air defense systems. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video and see what we have. And you can hear the Russian absolutely shocked in the background. There is one of their expensive fighter jets falling to the ground on fire and burning, and it is just falling literally straight out of the sky. So it looks to me like another Russian casualty has struck in Crimea, and they've lost another one of those very expensive jets, which they cannot afford to lose at this point. But with that, moving on to our next article here, we have one from Nexta TV, and we're learning that Russia is preparing for a powerful new offensive on the front line, according to The Economist, and Ukraine's ability to hold off a Russian offensive this time looks less certain than in the past, according to The Economist, that is, and this is why the country urgently needs to mobilize more troops and build a stronger defense line. And I would disagree with The Economist just a little bit here. When they say that Russia is preparing for a powerful new offensive, Russia's pretty much put all their power behind the last offensives, and it really didn't get anywhere. Zelensky came out and said they held off all of the attacks, and of course we see that Russia is not gaining hardly any ground whatsoever. So in my opinion, I think Ukraine's ability to hold off a new offensive by Russia is probably at the same level it was in prior invasions. So I'm not really sort of feeding into the fear-mongering here by The Economist. they have a valid point. Of course, I think The Economist is trying to raise awareness to get more funds to Ukraine, but I don't think Ukraine's about to fall tomorrow unless there's something out there that we're not aware of. So with that, let's go ahead and move into our next post here, which also goes to Nexta on Twitter. And this says, Russia's ambassador to Poland, Sergei Andreev, has left the country. And we can see from a statement from the Polish foreign minister, Radoslaw, he said Ambassador Andreev himself testified to his culture and professionalism of Russia. And as far as I heard, he's already left our territory. And it also said that the publication writes on a technical note, the Russian embassy said that Andreev left the country for the period from March 24th to April 4th. So apparently he decided to take a sudden vacation right after there was a provocation. It says earlier Andreev refused to appear at the Polish Foreign Ministry, where he was summoned in connection with the violation of Polish airspace by a Russian missile. And honestly, the Russian ambassador was probably wise to go on a vacation because there's really no justification that he could have provided to the Polish to justify why a missile violated NATO airspace. So I guess he figured it's better just to take off and run than to actually face accountability and explain why Russia did that. And moving on to our next post here, we have one this time from Fintech's News, and we see the Moscow terrorists received significant amounts of money in the form of cryptocurrency from Ukraine, according to TASS, which is Russian state media, of course, and that was from Russia's investigative committee. So once again, we're seeing Russia push this narrative that the Moscow terrorists were somehow affiliated or even funded by Ukraine themselves, and we just saw Lukashenko come out yesterday and absolutely demolish the propaganda narrative that the terrorists were actually trying to flee to Ukraine and were being assisted by Ukraine, because Lukashenko came out and said that the terrorists were actually heading toward Belarus first, and after Belarus basically turned them away and poked them with a stick, then they ran to Ukraine. So that really cleared that story up. And also this here lie about the terrorists receiving money from Ukraine in cryptocurrency. Russia has presented no evidence to back that up whatsoever, and once again, it's simply another Russian propaganda narrative to basically paint the story in the way they want it. But that didn't prevent the Russians from going ahead and basically declaring victory here, and it says Russia has proven the connection between the Moscow terrorists and Ukrainian nationalists, according to the investigative committee. So according to Russia, the investigation is all over now that they allege that Ukraine gave some cryptocurrency to these quote-unquote terrorists, and now that's proven the connection, even though Russia's presented no evidence whatsoever, and it's still just a blatant lie. But really though, that's not all that shocking, because Russia's been desperate to prove a connection, even if there is none, between Ukraine and these terrorists, and it appears that they're going to get their way no matter what. But anyways, moving on to our next post here, we have one from Jason J. Smart on Twitter, and if you remember this woman here holding the sign on Russian state TV, this happened closer to the beginning of the war. That woman here is actually, her sentence has been upheld by a Moscow court. She had an 8.5-year prison sentence for doing this right here, for quote-unquote spreading false information about the Russian army. And what did she say about the army? What did this poster say, by the way? The sign said, "No war, stop the war, do not believe the propaganda here, they're lying to you." So basically the message this sends to the Russian public is, do not oppose the war, and also do not oppose Putin, or you'll suddenly find yourself locked up in a gulag where it's very cold and very dry. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to our next article here, and this one is going to go to the Kyiv Post, and we can see that one day of war in Ukraine cost Russia at least $300 million, and that's USD, by the way, not the ruble. That would be trillions of rubles, most likely, according to the Wall Street Journal. And according to the publication, Putin is considering the possibility of raising taxes, including the introduction of a progressive tax, as Russia faces financial difficulties. And keep in mind that the Russian people have already been hit hard by the sanctions that the West has put on Russia at this point, and now Putin wants to tax the poor Russians even further by taking money from their pockets and putting it toward the war in Ukraine that is solely motivated by his own ego and interest to take back territory that doesn't belong to him. And now he's putting the Russian people through even financial turmoil by trying to raise taxes on them, which is absolutely insane. And surely this won't go over well in Russia, but I doubt anyone's going to be brave enough to speak out because they don't want to end up in the gulag. And with that, we're moving on to our next article here, which goes to Nexta, and it says the Patriot systems that are now in Ukraine were handed over to Ukraine not by the United States, but by other countries, according to Zelensky. And in this video, which we will not watch for the sake of time in this video, basically Zelensky was making the point that all the aid that Western countries are saying that is going to Ukraine is not directly going to Ukraine, but instead some of it is going to Western allies to help basically build up their systems, which then donate systems to Ukraine. Ukraine. So in short, Zelensky was basically asking for more aid for Ukraine, but of course, he was making the point that he was very grateful for the aid that has been sent thus far. But I do agree indeed, Ukraine does need more direct aid in the future, and of course, the United States is still stalling on that, and hopefully it does get cleared up pretty soon. But with that, we're moving on to our last article of the day, which goes to Insider Paper. And in this post, we can see that several nations are sending soldiers to help secure the Paris Olympics, and that was stated by France themselves. And of course, with France raising their terror alert to the highest level it's been in decades, then that is probably a wise precaution to secure the Olympics, because the Olympics is always a target for terrorism because it does represent so many different countries in the West. And with that, that is actually our last post of the day. And I hope you found this video informative, and if you have, be sure to press the like button and subscribe to the channel as well to get more daily war updates. And if you want to support our operation financially, we do have a Patreon page, and the link is in the description below, and you can go sign up over there, which does help us keep running because we are funded almost solely by the viewers, and your support makes this all possible. So with that, we'll see you all tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern on our nightly war news stream, and bye-bye for now.